Because the Hearing Protection Act, which seeks to remove suppressors or silencers from the National Firearms Act, is on the move in Congress, I want to talk a little bit about some of the legal issues associated with this to make you the smartest person in the room. And when you all call your congressman about this issue, you'll be sophisticated when you do so. Stay tuned. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, folks, so there's a lot of discussion right now on Capitol Hill. A lot of good vibes are going on concerning the possibility, the very strong possibility, in fact, that suppressors or silencers may be removed from the National Firearms Act. For those of you not familiar with this, in the 1930s, when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a terrible president in all respects, became president, one of the things that he did with his rabid anti-gun attorney general is they helped enact the National Firearms Act. In the National Firearms Act, they listed a series of items that were considered gangster weapons. And with that, they basically said you cannot possess these firearms if you don't pay what at the time was considered an astronomical tax of $200 per item. Now, without getting into too much detail about the NFA or the National Firearms Act, the one thing I do want to mention historically is this. If you look at the legislative record, the legislative history of the National Firearms Act, you'll find basically zero or almost zero references to why suppressors were added. In other words, there's really no historical basis for having suppressors or silencers to be considered a gangster weapon in any respect. Congress never made that finding, never paid attention to it. It's not even clear how it got in to the National Firearms Act, but it did. As a consequence, while the rest of the world is able to acquire suppressors for basically virtually no money all around the world, and it's considered a courtesy to have them so you don't bother your neighbors with shooting guns in your backyard kind of thing with noise concerns, here in the United States, because of this sort of anomaly that occurred in the 1930s with the National Firearms Act and suppressors being added, we have a weird system where even though, according to the National Firearms Act, I think the registry at least, we have somewhere around the order of magnitude of 3.5 to 4 million suppressors in the United States that have been registered under the NFA. This is really absurd for many reasons, one of which is forces everyone who wants to buy a suppressor to pay $200 to the federal government as a tax. Beyond that, it also creates a gun registry, or at least a gun owner registry, because you have to disclose all this information and admit and disclose to the federal government that you have the suppressor, which of course puts you on essentially the suppressor list, which by definition you're a gun owner, because why would you buy a suppressor if you don't have guns? So you create a de facto gun registry to a certain degree over something that should not be on the NFA list. Now, with that said, that little historical background, here's where we are now. There is now a push, a very strong push to enact what's called the Hearing Protection Act. Now, this is a big deal, folks, and a lot of other channels have done a great job covering this, so I'm not going to belabor the point. Jared over at Guns and Gadgets has done a great job keeping people in the loop, and you have a lot of organizations that are very much on top of this. Gun Owners of America, I suppose Firearms Policy Coalition, Second Amendment Foundation, the NRA, I presume are all working hard on Capitol Hill to make something good happen by removing suppressors out of the NFA. So that's where we are now. But let's talk about some of the legal niceties here. Again, there's a lot of people in the Second Amendment community, and rightly so, are encouraging you out there to call your congressperson and argue that the Hearing Protection Act should be enacted and suppressors should be fully removed from the National Firearms Act, and I totally support that effort. But I want to give you some legal nuances here, just, again, to make you the smartest person in the room. Number one, this is very important. The National Firearms Act is effectively a tax and spending law. You'll see why that's very important in a second. It's a tax law that says if you want to own one of these items on the NFA list, you have to pay a tax of $200 per item. This turns out to be a very good thing for us. And why is that? because there is a set of laws that we've talked about in the past on this channel called congressional or budget reconciliation. And you may be like, hey, Mark, why do I care about reconciliation? What exactly is that? Well, it's quite simple, you see. Remember when you used to watch Saturday morning cartoons and you used to watch that cartoon called When a Bill Becomes a Law on Capitol Hill, all that kind of stuff? Saturday morning cartoons, right? How does a bill become a law? Well, here's the thing. In modern day America, for a bill to become a law in Washington, if it is a substantive bill involving a substantive law, it has to pass the House of Representatives by majority vote, and it has to pass the United States Senate. But here's the thing. In the U.S. Senate, they have this thing called the filibuster, which basically says that you need 60 U.S. senators to vote for cloture. Cloture just means to close off debate on an issue, on a bill. If you don't have 60 votes to vote for cloture, you cannot vote for the bill, whatever it is, and turn it into a law. Now, here's why I want to give you that context. There is an exception, a big exception, that can get around that filibuster of 60 U.S. senators. Because remember, we don't have 60 Republican senators right now, which means the Democrats can use the filibuster in the U.S. Senate to shut down anything they don't like as a general matter. But there is a major exception to the filibuster situation, to the general rule that the Senate can use the filibuster to shut down debate. And that is called budget reconciliation. Budget reconciliation is a law that is narrowly focused on taxes and spending. Taxes and spending. It's basically purely about finances of the federal government. Nothing substantive, just how the money is spent, how the taxes are raised, and so on. Because the National Firearms Act is a tax and part of the federal government's financing, if you will, it actually falls almost certainly under the prospect of or falls within the context of a potential reconciliation bill. And because the NFA issue, a tax issue, falls within the context of reconciliation, it means that the Republicans in the House and the Republicans controlling the Senate can act or change, it seems, the National Firearms Act, which means one of two things. They can potentially pull suppressors out of the NFA, and or they could reduce the amount of money it takes to buy a suppressor from a $200 tax down to, let's say, a $5 tax. Now, there's been a lot of reporting about what's going on here, and I just want you to understand what's been reported. There is discussions in the Second Amendment community by prominent YouTubers like Jared over at Guns and Gadgets about the possibility that there's some Republicans and conservatives, so-called conservatives, that may be trying to avoid taking suppressors out of the NFA and instead simply reducing the tax to be paid on them from the $200 per suppressor down to $5 per suppressor. But that doesn't really solve the biggest part of the suppressor problem, which is that you have a suppressor gun registry, which means the federal government has a registry of gun owners. So the problem with the suppressor issue is not necessarily $5 versus $200. It is the fact that you have to actually go out and register yourself and the suppressor you acquire with the federal government, creating a gun registry, if you will. So the bottom line is, it seems to me, and again, there's smarter people out there looking at this than I am, that are working for the federal government, presumably for Congress, presumably for the White House, that are looking as to whether or not you can remove suppressors from the NFA and or can reduce the amount of taxes associated with NFA items, and whether or not these would fall under the definition of what would be a reconciliation bill. And it seems to me the answer should be yes. Should be yes. So hopefully what happens is that they do take suppressors out of the National Firearms Act entirely, which seems to be the right answer. Now, I should also just recommend to people involved directly with this fight, which I'm not. I'm reporting on what I've seen out there. There are people much more involved, and I applaud their efforts. But I just want to say that one thing that might be helpful to the effort to pull suppressors out of the National Firearms Act once and for all, which is the right answer, in addition to pointing out that the legislative history about why suppressors were put in there in the first place in the 1930s is basically non-existent, because there is no real evidence at all that gangsters were using suppressors or silencers, and these things got thrown in there who knows why, but they did. There's no legislative history on that. But beyond that, as I've talked about, suppressors are protected under the Second Amendment. Now, while the Second Amendment may not directly cause Congress to pass this Hearing Protection Act to remove suppressors out of the NFA, it may very well get them over the goal line, to push them a couple extra inches toward the right answer. And why I say that is this. Most of the arguments in favor of suppressors are practical arguments, and they're good arguments. They're things like, hey, everyone in Europe has a suppressor with a gun because it's polite for you don't make noise and bother your neighbor with noise pollution. Or there's no evidence that people use suppressors to commit crimes in any numbers to speak of. And obviously, we know from the excellent reporting of Lee Williams, the gun writer over there at the Second Amendment Foundation's journalism project, he's done specific reporting, in fact, on how the ATF just recently admitted that it issues $1,000 plus rifle suppressors for the health and safety of its law enforcement agents due to the extensive training and quarterly firearms qualifications they have to complete. This all by the reporting of Lee Williams, excellent writer, excellent researcher, excellent investigator, journalist. The point being, how is it possible that the ATF, for example, issues suppressors to all of their officers and somehow wants to make it difficult for American civilians to get suppressors for our benefit? Doesn't seem right, does it? But anyway, in addition to the practical realities of having suppressors protects hearing, which of course costs a lot of money. If you lose your hearing, guess what happens? It's very expensive to the healthcare system. So just in addition to being morally right to protect people's hearing and their quality of life and their health, if you want to talk about it from a societal point of view, it also is good from a point of view of spending less money on healthcare to address fewer hearing problems. Because hearing problems, like any other health problems, cost money to the healthcare system, cost money to Americans. And anytime we can avoid that, that's a good thing. But beyond that, I just want to remind everyone that as a matter of constitutional law, suppressors are protected arms, as I see it, and should be pulled out of the NFA, because if suppressors are protected arms under the Second Amendment, you cannot have direct taxes on them. We know that from basic constitutional law that I've taught you on this channel. Minneapolis Star from the 1980s, U.S. Supreme Court case says that if you have a targeted tax on ink, it violates the First Amendment. You can't have a targeted tax on a constitutional right, such as the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press. If you have a targeted tax on that, it's unconstitutional. We know from the 1960s, the Supreme Court precedent of Harper versus Board of Elections, a $1.50 poll tax on the right to vote violates the Constitution. Why? It's a targeted tax on a constitutional right. Likewise, if suppressors are protected arms under the text of the Second Amendment, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and you have a targeted tax on suppressors, that violates the Harper precedent. It violates the Minneapolis Star precedent. So the question is, are suppressors protected arms under the Second Amendment? And the answer, as we've talked about before, is undeniably yes. Because if you think about it, if I regulate or ban an arm, a firearm, that has a suppressor on it, what have I done? I've restricted the ability of Americans to use a firearm capable of firing suppressed rounds. Thus, I've either banned or restricted or regulated in some way or infringed upon the ability of Americans to fire or use firearms capable of firing suppressed rounds. So therefore, as a matter of text, of the right of the people to keep arms shall not be infringed. Suppressed firearms are indeed arms under the text of the Second Amendment. And then under those circumstances, for example, if it's a gun ban, the burden shifts to the government to show that these types of weapons are not in common use. But that's impossible for the government to prove that. Why is that? We know for a fact, just by looking at the ATF records of national NFA items, that there's well over 3.5 million suppressors that have been registered under the NFA alone. That is well beyond what anything would be considered in common use by Americans for lawful purposes. So the government could not possibly meet its burden to demonstrate that suppressors are dangerous and unusual weapons, because there's no way with those kinds of numbers out there of suppressors that the government could ever prove or satisfy its burden of proving that suppressors are unusual, and thus they cannot prove that suppressors are dangerous and unusual weapons. Beyond that, suppressors are not dangerous at all, right? I mean, you can't do anything with a suppressor that's dangerous in and of itself. It's like a safety. If anything, it refers to kind of a non-lethal item referenced by Justice Alito in his concurrence in Caetano in 2016. But beyond that, we also have to remember the language of Bruin. In 2022, the Supreme Court decided the Bruin case. You all know that, NYSERPA versus Bruin. And what do they have to say about arms? They specifically said that the Second Amendment covers modern arms. That would include suppressors. And specifically, here's what Bruin said. That arms includes modern instruments that facilitate armed self-defense. Modern instruments that facilitate armed self-defense. Well, an instrument is a broader term than weapon. There's a lot of things that are out there that are instruments that are not weapons. So if you're dealing with a modern instrument that facilitates, which means helps, doesn't mean necessary for, it just means helps. To facilitate is to help. Armed self-defense. And what does a suppressor do? Well, a suppressor is an item. It's, by definition, an instrument. It's an item. It's an object. So it's clearly a modern instrument. And what is it there for? It facilitates or helps shoot guns safely for the user and the people around them, such as family members, which means it facilitates armed self-defense. So under the straightforward definition of what is an arm by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2022's Bruin decision, a suppressor is indeed a modern instrument that facilitates armed self-defense because it is an instrument that helps with armed self-defense. So it is clearly a Second Amendment arm, and it is in common use by virtue of the millions of people that have them. So it is protected under the Second Amendment no matter how you look at it. Now, the reason why I mention this is that if I were directly involved in trying to get suppressors out of the NFA and I was facing pushback by certain senators or congressmen, House members, I would point out this very point that suppressors are protected by the Second Amendment, and that is why. And keep in mind that as we sit here right now, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit down there in Louisiana and Texas is sitting on that case of Peterson, which a 3-judge panel wrongly decided suppressors were not arms under the Second Amendment. There is a pending motion to hear that case en banc with the entire Fifth Circuit to decide whether or not that suppressors are arms protected on the Second Amendment. And I suspect the Department of Justice in that Peterson case is going to clearly come out and say the suppressors are protected arms. So you could avoid cases and headaches like the Peterson case and win it once and for all if you remove suppressors from the National Firearms Act right here and right now. And a reason why you can justify it, in addition to all the practical reasons, such as the ATF officers use it, so why shouldn't we, as ordinary people, be allowed to use it? You can also make the constitutional case that it's protected, and a tax on suppressors pursuant to the NFA is unconstitutional in the same way that a tax targeting constitutional rights in Harper or Minneapolis Star is unconstitutional. All right, folks, so hopefully the Hearing Protection Act passes Congress. We'll keep you apprised. I know a lot of other people are doing this too, but I wanted to give you some legal concepts for you can keep in mind. Remember, this does get around the filibuster if you can use the reconciliation process, which is what we should be cheering for. So keep that in mind if you call your congressperson in Washington. Okay, folks, there you have it. Make sure you follow me on X @ForBoxer. Don't forget to subscribe to YouTube and Rumble. And I look forward to talking to you very soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.